We, as you know, we're going through comments from the folks from Capitol Hill that have an interest in this program, particular interest in it. Senator Nelson, of course, has a long and personal involvement in the program and has been clearly one of the great supporters of NASA and the space program. We're awfully glad you're here, and we welcome your thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to move over here where I can actually see you all instead of looking at the side of your head. I want you to understand the extraordinarily significant position that this panel brings itself to the table, because in essence, what you decide is going to be the significant influence for the White House and therefore also for the Congress in where the space program is going. And so I know you all know that, but I want you to hear from somebody that lives it every day that if you decide that X is going to be the case, the White House is a lot more likely to embrace X. And whether or not I or others disagree with X, it makes it much more difficult for us to be able to round up the votes in this kind of financial environment other than what you say is X. So you come to the table with extraordinary influence. And I know you all take the seriousness of this very much, but I wanted you to understand when we're dealing with a budget that is out of whack, as bad as it is, and I've just come from the Finance Committee trying to figure out what we're going to pass in the way of health reform, and of course costs are a major consideration, and so a lot of what, I wish it weren't this way, but a lot of where we're going with regard to our space program, which 10, 15, 20, 25 years down the line we may not have wished we had made in the prism of financial restraints. But that's the reality that we're dealing with now. So for your consideration, I think that you ought to seriously understand that from this senator's perspective, in what the Office of Management and Budget have laid out for the President's plan in the out years of 11, 12, 13, and 14 are entirely deficient for where we're going. Now, part of your charter is that you are to lay out options, and you're also to be mindful of the fiscal restraints. NASA simply can't do the job that it's been given with the President's goal of being on the moon by 2020 if you take the OMB numbers. I have clashed swords with Dr. Orszag, who I have a great deal of respect. I have sat in prayer sessions with Dr. Holmgren, and I just want you to know that if you come out with those numbers, there's no way that NASA can be on the moon by 2020. There's no way that with those numbers that are coming, and there's nothing magic about those numbers. Those numbers were a group of folks who trying to come out with a president's political document in addition to it being an economic document about showing how over the next 5 years that you get the budget deficit down to 3% of the gross national product. But the president starts out crippled because he's inheriting what he thought was a $1.7 trillion deficit in the current year, but in fact it's going to be closer to $1.9 trillion. So understand the context in which that is. If you adopted those out-year numbers of the president's budget, which I'm trying to tell you is really not the president's budget. Therefore, that's all the more reason your panel is important, because the president is looking to you to really come up with where we should go in our space program. But if you adopted those numbers, we would have a 4 or 5 year gap with no American human rated launch system, and that would expand to 6, 7, possibly 8 years. And I don't think anybody wants us to continue in the circumstance where we are the only way to get to the International Space Station, which we built and paid for, to the tune of $100 billion, that we want to continue to stay in a multi-year period dependent upon the Russians. It's my hope that our foreign relations with the Russians are going to get better, but who knows what the geopolitics is going to be later on in this coming decade. So I ask you to consider that. I also ask you to consider that the last several years of budgets haven't been realistic. NASA was asked to do too much with too little, and that has led us to the point that we are now, with a space shuttle that's going to shut down, but without the new rocket having been developed in time to pick up where the space shuttle leaves off. And a series of budget documents over the last several years that in fact were unrealistic because they only went out to 2015 and played like the International Space Station was going to go away in 2015. Well, if it's taken this long to build it, and it is really a wonderful tool in foreign relations in the fact that it truly is international, and if we've spent $100 billion, I don't think we want to shut it down in 2015. And therefore, I think you ought to consider in your deliberations the continuation of that. Now, you all had specifically asked me to make a comment, and then I will sit down within my prescribed time about where we are with regard to the NASA authorization bill. We authorized NASA's funding for the next several years in a 2008 NASA authorization bill. And the policy of that authorization bill is exactly what I've just said. The funding was not what I've just said, but the authorization for funding is what I have just said. That the policy was to reduce the gap in human spaceflight capability, and also, because of that, to mitigate the impact of having to lay off a dedicated workforce of highly skilled workers. And so you will see that the authorization for the current year, 2009, when you add the $400 million that we got in the stimulus for exploration, it actually brought it up to the funding, the appropriations, it all actually brought it up close to what the authorization was, which was $3.9 billion for exploration in the current year. Whereas what we authorized for space operations, which was well above the president's request, I'll round it, $6 billion. What was appropriated was about $250 million less than that. And yet you still have to launch the space shuttle. So appropriations just simply didn't match what was authorized. We got some help through the omnibus appropriations and the stimulus bill of getting additional money in. But other than that, the projections for the future in the president's budget are unrealistic. Just a couple of other comments on the authorization bill. We said science and exploration should not be in competition with each other. They're compatible. We clearly nailed down the policy that we ought to be prepared to operate the space station until 2020, and that we had to put it in because back then NASA was operating like they had two additional missions. They had some term. They called them contingent. And as we would bring the administrator in front of us, well, why do you call it contingent? Well, I can tell you Dr. Griffin didn't want to call it contingent. He was calling it contingent simply because the Office of Management and Budget was telling him that he had to. And so we said, well, why is it contingent? And basically it came out in the hearings that that was just a name. So you're looking at a full complement of space shuttle missions to fully assemble and to equip the International Space Station. And then we did one more thing in the authorization bill. We authorized an additional flight. And that was there were a bunch of scientific instruments that were going to be left on the ground that were configured to fly in the cargo bay of the space shuttle, but NASA wasn't planning for it. And to the credit of the new president, this is one of the commitments that he made in the course of the campaign, and he has fulfilled that commitment by adding the additional flight, so that from now on there are 8 flights remaining of the space shuttle. The one other thing that the president has committed to is that although budgetary-wise, NASA, because OMB tells them to do this, is planning that the space shuttle is going to shut down by the end of 2010, the president has committed publicly that if we do not get the rest of the 8 flights up by the end of 2010, that we will continue to fly the space shuttle until those 8 flights, which includes the last one, the scientific missions, including the AMS, until they are all flown to complete the construction of the station and the equipping of it. So that could have some financial consequences. If we go into 2011, then additional monies are going to have to be generated, and I made sure they got on the record publicly on this, and not take that out of the rest of NASA's budget. So that's a summary, Mr. Chairman, of what I wanted to tell you. Now, I would just add one other thing, that NASA is now going to have a great leader. And this is someone that I worked very hard to get drawn to the attention of the White House and the President. And it has been a very happy day for me, and I think many others in NASA, in the space community, that the President has nominated, and I expect soon to be confirmed by the Senate, Charlie Bolden. I think he brings the quality of being able to be not only a strong leader with an enormous understanding of both human and unmanned space, but I think he brings the qualities of a consensus builder, which is so necessary at a time like this. So with that kind of leadership, with the imprimatur of what you decide, which I think is going to be key as to where our space program is going in the future. With the two of those, we ought to be off on a good road ahead for the nation's space program. I am happy to entertain any questions or comments from you all.
Well, Senator, thank you very much. You certainly encapsulate, I think, the challenge that the space program faces. Your comments are very sobering to us. I think we well realize the responsibility we have, and you certainly sharpened that in our views. Do any of my colleagues have questions that you would like to ask? I've had a chance to visit with the Senator some in his office on this subject in the last couple of weeks, so I won't ask anything, but if anybody else does, this is the time. And I think that nobody has anything for you, so we'll just thank you so much
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
for being here.
Thank you.